Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's begin. Between the world and the shadow. No one knew where the hurricane came from. On the maps, it appeared suddenly. A massive mass of raging wind, spinning around itself, destroying everything in its path. Scientists could not explain its nature. It had neither the usual eye nor a predictable trajectory. It was a force of nature beyond the laws of physics. The city of St. Jude, located on the Louisiana coast, was unprepared. At first, the wind only bent trees, tore off roofs, and broke power lines. But then something worse began. Darkness swallowed the sky, and people heard a terrifying sound, as if hundreds of thousands of voices were screaming at once. The electricity went out, communication was lost, and black waves of dust and water rolled through the streets. People hid in basements, but the buildings collapsed. Some tried to escape in their cars, but the wind overturned them like children's toys. The sky split open. It didn't just turn black. It looked like a gigantic mouth, devouring everything around. The last thing the city's residents remembered were screams, the screeching of metal, and a sudden feeling of falling. Then there was silence. When people came to, they were no longer on Earth. Jude lay in the midst of a wasteland. The sky above was purple, and two enormous moons cast a dead light on the ruins. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the air itself resisted their breathing. The streets of the city no longer led anywhere. They ended in darkness, which even the bravest dared not step into. The first to disappear was a boy who decided to scout the area. He moved away from the group of frightened people gathered near the town hall and simply vanished. His screams were brief. People ran toward the sound, but they only found his red jacket, torn to pieces, and something strange on the ground, a dark, greasy liquid that seemed to move. The next night, 3 more disappeared. They had hidden in their own house, locking the doors and windows, but it didn't help. In the morning, the neighbors found only an empty room. Long scratches were left on the floor, as if someone had been dragged away. People began to notice silhouettes in the fog. Tall, thin figures with shining eyes watched them from the darkness. They didn't move while they were seen, but once someone turned away, they got closer. On the 3rd night, the real nightmare began. The creatures emerged from the shadows. They didn't run, nor make any noise, but their movements were unnaturally fast. Their skin resembled wet stone, and thick dark liquid dripped from their mouths. They didn't eat people. They just tore them apart. Only a few dozen remained. They had hidden in the underground parking lot of a shopping center. Someone found a weapon, but the bullets just bounced off the monsters. Others tried to find a way to escape, struggling to understand where they were. And then they understood. This was not just another planet. This was a horrifying, sick world created for hunting. Time did not exist here. Every hour felt like eternity, then could pass in a second. The monsters became increasingly intelligent. They learned to avoid traps, predicted the movements of their victims. Once, a group of survivors found a massive black monolith in the middle of the wasteland. It had symbols engraved on it, ancient, strange signs that seemed to whisper in their heads. "This isn't a coincidence," whispered one of those who could read ancient inscriptions. "We were brought here. This was planned." He ran his fingers over the symbols, and the ground beneath them trembled. In the distance, something roared. The city began to change. Streets twisted, buildings bent as if made of clay. Everyone still alive ran, but where to? There was no exit. A black void opened beneath them, and they began to fall. And then, awakening. Those who were still alive came to in the ruined city, but no longer on an unknown planet. They were back in St. Jude. But the city lay in ruins, and there was no one around. They stepped out onto the main square and saw themselves. People were approaching them from afar. They looked familiar. They were them. the people they were before the hurricane. But there was no life in their eyes. The survivors stood in the main square, staring at their doppelgangers, who silently approached. It was impossible. Each of them saw themselves, an exact copy, dressed in the same clothes, with the same facial expressions, but something was wrong. The eyes. Their eyes were empty, black, as if the pupils had dilated so much that they swallowed all the white. The doppelgangers didn't speak. They just stood there, creating a perfect mirror image. The survivors stepped back, and the doppelgangers repeated the movement. One man, George Weston, couldn't take it anymore and ran towards his reflection, trying to grab its shoulder. As soon as he touched his doppelganger, something changed. The darkness in the copy's eyes expanded even more, engulfing its entire body. It began to change. Bones cracked, the skin bubbled as if it were boiling liquid, and then, George screamed. His body began to dissolve into the air, as if it were being wiped out of reality. Everyone stepped back, and his doppelganger merely tilted its head to the side, as if studying its victim, and then slowly lowered its hands and froze. A dead silence fell. The survivors realized they couldn't touch their doppelgangers. But what could they do? There were more and more of them. The streets were filling with these strange copies. Children, women, men, everyone who had once lived in St. Jude stood among the ruins, but now they were just husks. Kevin, a young man, suggested checking the city's borders. If they had returned, maybe there was a way to escape? The group moved forward, weaving through their doppelgangers, who stood motionless. It seemed they only acted when touched. On the way, they heard sounds. At first, it was just a quiet hum, but with each step, it grew louder, as if something enormous was approaching from behind the horizon. The purple sky trembled. They left the city's limits and saw what made their blood freeze in their veins. From afar, a colossal shadow moved toward them. A gigantic creature with countless limbs reaching toward the ground like the roots of a tree torn from the earth. Its body consisted of countless faces, shifting one after another. The eyes on these faces were as black as those of the doppelgangers. It was something more than just a monster. It was death itself come to take them. The people ran back, but the doppelgangers no longer stood still. They moved forward, cutting off their path to the city. "We're trapped," screamed Sarah, a young woman holding her little daughter in her arms. "No, there's a way out," shouted one of the men, pointing to an old Catholic church on the outskirts of the city. They rushed toward it, passing through the ruins and avoiding the touch of the doppelgangers. The doors of the church were half open. They dashed inside and slammed the doors shut behind them. Silence. Inside, everything was just as it had been before. Wooden benches, an altar, an old priest standing at the back of the hall. But when he turned around, the people realized they had made a mistake. His eyes were black. He smiled and whispered, "You're already home." The light went out, and the screams began again. The darkness swallowed everything. The screams still echoed through the air, but gradually faded, replaced by a whisper. Warm, sticky, like cobwebs, it crept into the minds of the survivors. Their legs no longer obeyed, their eyes closed on their own, and the last thing they saw was the priest's face slowly stretching into an impossible, bottomless smile. When they woke up, the city was normal again. The rain lightly tapped on the windows. The sun broke through the gray clouds, and in the distance, the sound of cars and sirens could be heard. People walked the streets, ordinary living people. They were heading to work, smiling, talking on the phone, laughing. Kevin stood on the street corner, not understanding what had happened. Next to him were Sarah, her daughter, and a few other people. They all remembered. They had seen the darkness, the monsters, the hurricane that took them to a world of terror. But now the city looked as if none of it had ever happened. This can't be real," Sarah whispered. "Did we return?" asked one of the men. Kevin looked at the people passing by. They seemed ordinary, but only at first glance. Something was wrong. Their movements were too smooth, their faces too symmetrical. And most importantly, When they smiled, their eyes remained empty. Kevin turned around. Behind them stood the same old church. The doors were closed, but someone had scratched a word into the wooden boards. Watching. A chill ran down his spine. This was not their city. And these were not people. They had returned. But not to the place they came from. Kevin glanced at his friends. They understood it too. A wave of horror washed over them, but they couldn't escape. Not now. Because the people walking past them suddenly stopped. And one by one, they turned their heads in their direction. And then they smiled. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.